Hi everyone, today we are going to be learning about adaptive immunity. I recommend having this set of drawing notes in front of you. You will also want writing and coloring utensils. Let's go ahead and get started. Adaptive immunity is also known as acquired immunity. This is because you acquire this immunity due to exposure to different types of pathogens. So for example, if you were exposed to the seasonal flu in 2019, it is unlikely you will get the exact same flu again that year. So with that in mind, I want you to also add the idea that this is a specific response. So that isn't provided in a blank, but I want you to make sure that you add that this is a specific response. You develop specific antibodies in response to something you are directly exposed to. This is the second response. So remember that you start with the innate immune response, and then this gets activated when needed, which is why this is also a delayed response. As you can see on your paper here, there are two divisions of the adaptive immune response. The first division that we'll be learning about is called the humoral response. The second division of the adaptive immune response is called the cell-mediated response. We will start by focusing on the humoral response first. The humoral response occurs in the blood or the lymph fluid. Remember that you learned that in the cardiovascular system you have blood vessels that carry oxygen all over your body. It carries those blood cells everywhere. So humoral response is when there's pathogens invading your bloodstream, and this is where this response is initiated. You also have a highway system of lymph vessels, and the lymph vessels carries all of the white blood cells associated with the immune response as well. Do you remember how in the innate immune response you have macrophage cells or dendritic cells that can activate the helper T cells? Well, now those helper T cells are going to activate the humoral response by activating B cells with the invader's antigens. Remember that antigens are those little proteins on the surface of the pathogens, including bacterial cells and viruses. Well, these helper T cells will basically activate the B cells by giving them the specific antigen. One way that I remember humoral and B and blood is I remember B cells, which starts with B, obviously, and so does blood. So this is occurring in the blood. One way that I remember humoral is that it's the humors of the body. That's kind of an ancient word that refers to the fluids inside. So if you can remember B cells for blood, and it's the humoral response, this will help you a lot. Once these B cells are activated using the enemy's antigens, those activated B cells can then be cloned or copied, and now they are called plasma B cells. Now that we have tons of activated plasma B cells, these plasma B cells will release proteins called antibodies. These antibodies are proteins that look like Y shapes, and they specifically match the antigen of the specific invader that's entering the body. So if there's a flu virus entering the body, it has these antigens that mark it as a flu virus. Your plasma B cells will create antibodies that specifically match this antigen. So one way that I remember this is antibodies has a B in it. So plasma B cells release antibodies in the blood. That's a memory clue. If you want, you could write it down somewhere in your margins. Now, these antibodies will do a really important job. So say we have a virus that's invading. I'm just going to draw a virus, six-sided virus, and our virus has these antigens on its surface. Well, remember that these antibodies will specifically match them. So we've got an antibody that will bind, or multiple antibodies that will bind to that invading cell. And what's really cool about this process is that these antibodies will attack these flu viruses or bacteria. And when they do this, it causes invaders, those pathogens, to form up and form clumps, which means that these viruses are moving very, very slowly through the blood. And this is a benefit because if they're moving really slowly, it allows other cells, such as the macrophages, it allows macrophages to come along and gobble them up. So this is a really cool process where these plasma B cells release antibodies in the blood, and that causes viruses and pathogens to slow down and clump up, which allows macrophages to come and eat them up. Now, when these plasma B cells are releasing tons of these antibodies, they can get worn out pretty fast. So they have a pretty short lifespan. But some of those surviving plasma B cells, after the infection has been defeated, those plasma B cells can now become memory B cells. Memory B cells. And these memory B cells are stored in the bone marrow of your long bones, like your leg bones. And these memory B cells can be cloned again in cases of secondary exposure to the exact same invader. And so if you do get exposed to the exact same flu virus that same season, well, you already have the memory B cells. So they will be able to quickly release antibodies and defend your body and destroy those invading viruses before you get sick again. Before we move on to cell-mediated, let's go to the bottom of our page to kind of illustrate what this part looks like. All right, so let's recap. Say you are exposed to a pathogen. Let's again use the flu virus as an example. Your dendritic cell will eat one of those viruses, and it will take the antigen from that invading flu virus, and it will use this antigen to activate the helper T cell. So it's basically saying, yo, helper T cell, this is what the enemy looks like. So now it's giving the helper T the enemy cell's antigens. Now that helper T cell is used to activate the humoral response and the cell-mediated response within the adaptive immune response. So let's focus on the left side, or our humoral response first. So we have our helper T cell that's activated, and now it is going to activate a plasma B cell. So here we have our plasma B cell. And this plasma B cell is going to basically grow these antibodies that are specific to the enemy that's invading. Remember, antibodies are those little Y-shaped proteins. So here are the antibodies. And these antibodies are specifically going to look for the specific antigen of this invader. So I'm just going to draw some of those antigens bonded to these antibodies. Okay, so we've got our plasma B cell. It's coated in antibodies that specifically match the enemy antigen. Now this plasma B cell is also going to start releasing, so I'm going to draw an arrow, it's going to start releasing more of these specific antibodies into the bloodstream. So these antibodies are going to be flowing through your bloodstream. And in fact, if you have antibodies present in your bloodstream, doctors can basically collect your blood and look for these antibodies to see what kind of thing you might be fighting off. For example, this is used to determine if someone is, for example, if someone has the antibodies for the coronavirus, it means they've been exposed to the coronavirus, just as an example. So these are your antibodies that are floating through your bloodstream or your lymph fluid, and they're going to attack the enemy invaders. Now, if that virus is defeated, some of those plasma B cells will now become memory B cells. And those memory B cells are also coated in these antibodies. Like that. And basically they will match any of those invading antigens if you're ever exposed to the exact same virus again. Now, we'll talk about this later too, but what's important to recognize is that viruses can evolve. Their antigens change. And so that means that if you have the memory B cells for the 2019 flu, you will not be immune to the 2020 flu because those antigens have slightly changed. We'll talk about this more when we get to coronavirus especially. So now that we've covered the humoral response that's occurring in the humors or fluids of the body, we are now going to dive into the cell-mediated response. So the cell-mediated response occurs in infected body cells that are producing viruses. Viruses are really fascinating because in order for viruses to reproduce, they basically are like zombies. They will attack the healthy cells of your body, and they will turn your cells into virus reproduction machines. So your body, at the same time that they're fighting off in the blood, you need to destroy the cells in your body that are producing more and more viruses. So cell-mediated response is basically destroying your cells that have been turned into virus replication zombies. So these helper T cells will activate cells that are called killer T cells. So it's a type of T cell similar to the helper T cell, but it's called a killer T cell. Another word for it that you might see is cytotoxic. The prefix cyto means cell, and toxic obviously means that it destroys. So helper T cells activate other types of T cells called cytotoxic or killer T cells, and they do this again using the enemy's antigens. So that way the killer T cells know exactly what to look for. Now these killer T cells, once they're activated, they can be cloned, just like the plasma B cells. So we want to make more and more copies of them. And then these killer T cells travel through the body to the infection site, and they inject the infected body cells with a protein called perforin. Perforin. So perforin is basically like a bullet. It's a protein that causes the body cells to explode or burst, which is pretty cool. So again, just to recap, helper T cells activate killer T cells. The killer T cells know exactly what antigens to look for. They travel to the site of the infection and they destroy the infected body cells using bullets called perforin proteins that cause the body cells to burst. Now, just like the plasma B cells, once this infection has been won, we have some killer T cells that can become memory T cells. Memory T cells. And these memory T cells can be stored in the bone marrow of your long bones. And then if you're exposed to the exact same type of antigen ever again, you can immediately activate these killer T cells and they can prevent the infection from getting severe. Let's take a look at what this looks like in a picture form. All right, so again, we have our dendritic cell from the innate immune response. The dendritic cell, it activates the helper T cell with the specific antigen. And then your helper T cell will activate your killer T cell by giving it the exact same antigen that it's supposed to look for and destroy. This is your killer T cell. And this killer T cell will then release a ton of perforin bullets. Perforin. So these perforin bullets will basically destroy any infected cells. And once that battle is won, we have memory T cells that are left over so that if we're ever exposed to the exact same antigen again, they can immediately destroy any of your cells that get infected. All right, so to zoom out, we've got two divisions of the adaptive immune response. And the key here are these helper T cells. We need these helper T cells in order to activate both divisions of the adaptive immune response. Now we're going to pause to illustrate this process as if it was happening in your body. Oh, sorry. All right, let's start with a brief recap of what happens in adaptive immunity. So remember that adaptive immunity is the second step. It starts with innate immunity, activating the adaptive immunity. And this is done through antigen-presenting cells, also called APCs. So antigen-presenting cells of the innate immune response travel to the lymph nodes in your body to activate the helper T cells that are stored there. So antigen-presenting cells of the innate immune response include macrophages and dendritic cells. And both of these types of cells will have basically gobbled up at least one enemy cell, and they now have the antigens of that enemy. So they deliver the antigen to the helper T cell in order to activate it and turn it on. So once this helper T cell is activated in the lymph nodes, it can then travel to one of two places. It will go to the blood or the lymph fluids, or it will go to the tissues of your body and the body cells. Let's start with the left side of your page, which is the humoral response. Pause the video if you need to take some time to illustrate this. All right, so we're going to start with the humoral response. So I drew an arrow from the helper T cell and labeled it humoral. This means that we're starting with the plasma B cell. Remember that plasma B cells are coated in proteins called antibodies, and I used the wrong shade of blue. Okay, so we're going to start with our antibodies that are covering the surface of our plasma B cell. And the humoral response has now been activated using the specific antigens of the invading cell, which binds to the plasma B cell. Now this plasma B cell is going to start releasing tons of these very specific antibodies into the bloodstream and the lymph fluid. And these antibodies are just going to float around, and they are basically going to look for these invading pathogens. So say we've got some viruses. I'm going to draw some viruses over here. Could be coronavirus, could be flu virus. We've got some viruses here, and they've got their, oops, wrong color. We've got the antigens that are coding these viruses that are floating around. And these antibodies are going to swarm these viruses, and they are going to bind to and bind them and cause them to clump up. And the benefit of causing them to clump is because then they travel not as far. That means that they're easily captured by macrophages, and then they're less likely to infect more areas of the body. So I'm going to draw a big macrophage cell. The macrophages are called macrophages because they are big eaters. There's my macrophage, and it is going to gobble up those flu viruses. Okay. Now, after this battle is won and after the response is concluded, we can then form memory B cells, which can be saved in the long bones in the bone marrow for another infection. So memory B cells at the end. And that is the humoral response in a nutshell. Humoral is in the humors of the body, which is the blood or the lymph fluid, and it involves the B cells, which release antibodies. Now let's go into the adaptive immune response division that's called the cell-mediated division. So I'm going to draw another arrow going this direction, and I'm going to label this cell-mediated. Okay, so we've got our cell-mediated response, which involves the activation of cells called killer T cells. And these killer T cells are given the enemy's antigen, so they know exactly what to look for. And over here on the right side, these boxes basically represent infected body cells. So say, for example, these are some of the cells of your esophagus, your throat. And these infected body cells are basically damaged. Okay, so they are basically pumping out virus after virus after virus. And we need to destroy those infected body cells so that you stop spreading the virus. And that's why, for example, when you cough, every time you cough and you have a virus infection like this, you're basically spreading those viruses in the air through this process. And that's how viruses reproduce. So we need to destroy these infected body cells. So this killer T cell will release a ton of bullets called perforin. Pew pew. And these bullets are going to puncture and cause these infected body cells to explode. So you could just draw kind of like big X's through them because they're going to explode as a result of this perforin. So if you want, you can label perforin here. Perforin. All right. And so that's an example here of how the killer T cells are used to prevent viruses from spreading further. And then after the battle is won, you can then form memory T cells as a result. So that way, if you get exposed to the exact same type of antigen again, you can immediately kill any infected body cells by recognizing them. So this is the adaptive immune response. It basically develops due to exposure. So your immune system gets stronger as you get exposed to more things. It is a delayed response. And it's very specific. Your adaptive immune response is specific according to the things you've already been exposed to in order to form these memory B cells and memory T cells. If you have any questions or need any help, please make sure you're checking all of the resources that we post in the daily agenda, including supplemental videos, and send us messages if you need anything at all. We wish you all the best, and thanks for watching. Take care.